The Unbending Oar. The storm took the Fortuna Maris on the 9th day out of Alexandria, and it took her the way a man takes a promise he never meant to keep, suddenly, completely, without apology. Cordus stood lashed to the steering oar with a length of wet hemp cutting into his forearms, watching the mainmast come down in a slow arc that seemed, for one absurd heartbeat, almost graceful. Then it struck the deck and the world became noise. He had captained ships for 19 years. He had learned, in that time, to read the sea the way other men read faces, the small tells before the larger truths, the flattening of a swell that meant deep water turning shallow, the particular green-black color the sky wore before it opened. He had thought, more than once, that he understood the sea's mood well enough to bargain with them. That night taught him otherwise. The sea did not bargain. It simply was indifferent to the 41 men who had trusted their lives to his judgment, indifferent to the cargo of Egyptian grain that would have fed a district of Rome through the winter, indifferent to the small clay lamp shaped like a dolphin that his daughter had pressed into his hands at the dock, saying, "so you don't forget the way home." He did not remember making the decision to cut the mast free. He remembered only the axe in his hands, and then the ship rising on a swell that should have swamped her and did not, and then, hours later, grey light and 11 men left of 41 and no cargo at all, and the coastline of Italy a smudged line on a horizon that offered no comfort for what it had cost to reach. They limped into Ostia 9 days late, riding low and empty, and Cordus walked up from the harbour with salt still crusted white in his beard, already composing in his mind the accounting he would have to render to the grain merchants who had trusted him with their money, already grieving the 11 wives who would learn today that they were widows, and thinking, the entire walk up the Via Oscensis toward Rome, of Livia's face when he told her, and of how he would explain to Prima that the storm had eaten the dolphin lamp along with everything else, that even her small charm against forgetting had not been strong enough. He did not yet know that grief was waiting for him at a different door than the one he expected. The house was too quiet when he reached it. That was the first wrongness, the kind a sailor's mind catalogues before it understands. No smoke from the kitchen. No sound of Prima's sandals slapping against the tile as she ran to greet him, a habit she had never outgrown even at 13. He pushed open the door and found his neighbour Sextus sitting in the atrium in the dim light, an old man made older by whatever news he was carrying, and Cordus understood before a word was said that the sea was not, after all, the worst thing that had happened to him that month. "The fever came through 11 days ago," Sextus said. His voice had the flat, careful quality of a man who has rehearsed a sentence because he cannot bear to say it any other way. The soldiers brought it back from the east. It moved through the subura like fire through dry grass. Livia, he stopped. Started again. Livia went first, and then Prima 3 days after, nursing her mother. "I am sorry, Cordus. I am so sorry. We did everything the physicians said. It was not enough. It has not been enough for anyone." Cordus stood in the doorway of his own house, still smelling of salt and bilge water, and found that he had no words at all, not Latin, not Greek, not the rough sailor's argot he'd picked up on the docks of a dozen ports. He had crossed a killing sea to bring home nothing, and the sea, it turned out, had been the lesser thief. He did not remember much of the days that followed. He knew that he sat for a long time in Prima's room, where her small collection of shells sat undisturbed on a shelf he had built for her the summer she turned 9. He knew that he refused food for 2 days and then ate mechanically for reasons that had nothing to do with hunger. He knew that he went once to the temple of Neptune near the harbour and stood before the god's cold marble face and said things to it that he would later be ashamed of, accusations, curses, a long and detailed inventory of everything he had done correctly as a captain, a husband, a father, as if righteousness were a currency the universe was obligated to accept in trade for his losses. The god, being marble, said nothing back. This seemed to Cordus, in his rawest grief, like a kind of confirmation. The universe did not answer. It had never been listening. Men built temples and made offerings and told themselves stories about justice and reward because the alternative, that the world simply moved forward, crushing what stood in its path without malice and without mercy, exactly as indifferent to virtue as to vice, was more than most men could stand to look at directly. He had looked at it directly now. He found he could not look away again. It was in this state, some 3 weeks after his return, that he met the old man in the colonnade near the grain exchange. Cordus had gone there out of habit rather than purpose, some dim animal instinct pulling him back toward the world of ships and cargo and debts, even though he could not yet imagine caring about any of it again. He was sitting on a stone bench, staring at nothing, when a voice beside him said, "You have the look of a man arguing with someone who isn't there." Cordus turned. The man was perhaps 60, thin in the way of someone who had once been thinner still, and out of necessity rather than choice, with a face weathered less by sun than by a lifetime of paying close attention to things other men overlooked. He wore a plain grey tunic, unremarkable, the kind a freedman of modest means might wear, and he carried nothing, no walking stick, no satchel, nothing that marked him as belonging to any trade Cordus recognized. "I am arguing with the sea," Cordus said, because it was easier than the truth. "And with a God who doesn't answer." "Ah." The old man settled onto the bench without being invited, which struck Cordus as either rude or entirely unbothered by the possibility of being rude, and something about the second interpretation made him, despite everything, almost smile. The sea rarely answers either. I've noticed this is a common feature of the things men argue with most passionately: walls, weather, the dead, the gods. None of them talk back. And yet we persist, hoping this time will be different. You find that amusing. I find it human. There is a difference, though I grant the two overlap more than philosophers like to admit. The old man studied him for a moment, and there was nothing pitying in the look, which Cordus found he was grateful for. He had received enough pitying looks in the past weeks to last a lifetime, and each one had felt like a small further theft, as though his grief were being catalogued and filed away by an accountant of sorrows rather than witnessed by another human being. "You've lost something recently." "More than one something, I'd guess, from the way you're sitting, like a man who's been struck twice and is still waiting to see if a third blow is coming." "My ship, my cargo, 30 of my crew, my wife, my daughter." Cordus said it flatly, the way he might have once given a report to a harbour official, because he had found that flatness was the only register in which he could say these words at all without the whole structure of himself coming apart. "In that order, more or less, though I understand I'm meant to be more troubled by the second half of the list than the first." "Are you troubled by the second half of the list?" "I don't know what I am." This was the truest thing Cordus had said aloud since the harbour at Ostia. "I keep waiting to feel something that makes sense. Grief, I understand grief. I have grief. But underneath it there is something else, something that feels more like betrayal, I suppose, though I couldn't tell you who betrayed me. The gods, if they exist and are as indifferent as they seem. The world, for continuing to turn as though nothing happened. Myself, maybe, for having believed for 40 years that if I did the careful thing, the correct thing, the pious thing, some balance would be kept on my behalf. I have spent my whole life reading storms before they came and cutting losses before they became disasters, and none of it mattered. None of it. My wife did not die because I made an error. My daughter did not die because I failed to prepare. They died because a fever came through the subura, the way fevers do, the way storms do, the way all of it does, and no amount of care on my part could have stood between them and it." He had not meant to say so much. He was surprised, faintly, at himself. He was not a man given to speaking freely with strangers, and grief had if anything made him more guarded, not less. But there was something in the old man's stillness that invited it, an absence of the flinching most people did when confronted with another's raw pain, as though he had made his peace, long ago, with the fact that pain existed and needed somewhere to go. You've arrived, the old man said at the beginning of the only question that has ever mattered to me. I don't say that to diminish what you're carrying, I say it because I think you already sense that you're standing at a door, even if you don't yet know what's on the other side of it. My name is Nicandros. I was a slave for the first 30 years of my life and a free man for the last 20, and in both conditions I have found that the question is the same, though the furniture around it changes. The question is this: what, in all the world, actually belongs to you? Cordus frowned. My ship belonged to me. It's at the bottom of the sea now. Did it belong to you? Or did you merely hold it for a time, the way a man holds water in his cupped hands, real while it's there, and gone the moment his fingers can no longer contain it? And was it ever truly his asterisk in any sense that survives the losing of it? Nicandros did not say this as a rebuke. His tone was almost gentle, the tone of a man laying out a problem he had turned over in his own hands for decades and had long since stopped finding painful, even if he had not stopped finding it serious. I ask you honestly, not as a trick. What is it that a man can lose and still remain, in every way that matters, entirely himself? Because I think you will find, if you look closely enough, that the list is shorter than you imagine, and that everything on the long list you were keeping, the ship, the cargo, even, forgive me for saying it because I know how it will sound, even the people you love, belongs to a category of things that were never, in the deepest sense, yours to keep. They were on loan. Everything is on loan. The question that will determine whether you spend the rest of your life at war with the world or at peace within it is whether you can learn to hold what is on loan the way a sensible man holds anything he knows he must someday return, with full attention, with full care, with full gratitude for the having of it, without mistaking the loan for a possession, and without letting the return of it, however early, however unjust it feels, break something in you that need not be broken. That is a cold comfort to offer a man who buried his daughter 3 weeks ago. It is not offered as comfort. Comfort is what people offer when they want you to stop feeling something inconvenient. I am not interested in you feeling less. Grieve as long and as fully as grief requires. I would think less of you as a father and a husband if you did not. What I am offering is not comfort. It is a map. Whether the terrain it describes helps you find your way through this or simply gives you a better name for the wilderness you're already standing in, that I can't promise. But I've found, in 60 years of watching men suffer, myself very much included, that a wilderness with a map, even an imperfect one, is more bearable than a wilderness with none. Cordus said nothing for a long while. Around them the business of the grain exchange continued, merchants shouting figures, porters hauling amphorae, the ordinary indifferent churn of a world that had not stopped for his losses any more than it had stopped for anyone else's, going back to the beginning of time. He found himself, despite everything, listening. "Tell me the map, then," he said. Asterisk. Nicandros did not tell him all at once. This, Cordus would come to understand, was itself a kind of teaching. The old man doled out his philosophy the way a careful physician doles out medicine, in doses calibrated to what the patient could actually absorb rather than in the single overwhelming draught that would satisfy the teacher's urge to be thorough. On that first day he said only this: "There is a distinction, the oldest and most useful one I know, between what is up to us and what is not. What is up to us, our judgments, our desires, our aversions, our choices about how to act, in short, the internal country each of us governs, whether we govern it well or badly. What is not up to us, our bodies, our property, our reputation, our position in the world, the actions of other people, the weather, the length of our lives, the lives of everyone we love. This second category includes nearly everything that most men spend their lives grasping at, and nearly everything that, when it is taken away, as it always eventually is, for everyone, without exception, produces the kind of suffering that has brought you to this bench today. The error is not in loving these things. Love them. Love them fiercely. A man who does not love his wife, his daughter, his ship, his good name, is not free of suffering. He is merely empty, and emptiness is not wisdom, whatever some cold-blooded philosophers might tell you. The error is in believing that love entitles you to permanence. It does not. Nothing entitles anyone to permanence. The wave does not owe the shore its return. The sea does not owe the sailor safe harbor because he has been careful. And the fever does not owe the good man his daughter's life because he has been virtuous. This is not cruelty in the universe. Cruelty would require intention, and there is no intention in a fever, no more than there is intention in a wave. There is only the vast, ceaseless, patternless unfolding of cause into cause, of which our small lives are a brief and, from within, deeply significant part, and yet from the outside, from the view a god might take if a god troubled to take any view of us at all, no more central to the order of things than a single ripple is central to the ocean. You're telling me my grief is a kind of error, a miscalculation. I'm telling you no such thing, and if I've spoken carelessly enough to give that impression, I'll say it again more precisely. Grief is not the error. Grief is the honest cost of having loved something that was never guaranteed to last, which is to say, of having loved anything at all, since nothing is guaranteed to last. The error, if there is one, lies elsewhere. It lies in the belief that you did something wrong, that the world owed you a different outcome because you were careful and pious and diligent. It lies in the rage you're carrying at a God who does not, I suspect, exist in the form you're raging at, or if he does, is not the kind of God who trades virtue for outcomes like a merchant at a stall. And it lies, perhaps most of all, in the exhausting effort of trying to control what was never within your power to control in the first place, and calling that effort love, when really it was closer to a kind of fear wearing love's clothing. Cordus felt something sharpen in his chest, not quite anger, but close to it, the particular indignation of a man who suspects he is being told an uncomfortable truth and does not yet want to admit its accuracy. So what would you have me do? Not care? Hold my grief at arm's length as though it belongs to someone else? No. I would have you feel it entirely, walk through the center of it, not around the edges, because the edges is where men get lost for years, even decades, circling a pain they refuse to enter fully and therefore never finish crossing. But I would also have you notice, while you're walking through it, which parts of your suffering come from the loss itself, and which parts come from your resistance to the loss from the part of your mind that keeps insisting, over and over, this should not have happened, as though the universe consults our preferences before acting. That second kind of suffering, the resistance, is the part that can be set down. Not today, perhaps. Not this month. But eventually, and only if you're willing to look at it honestly instead of letting it hide inside the first kind of suffering, wearing its face, borrowing its legitimacy. And how does a man tell the difference between the grief that is honest and the resistance that only pretends to be? Nicandros smiled for the first time since they had begun speaking, not a large smile, but a real one, the smile of a teacher recognizing that a student has, without quite realizing it, asked the only question worth asking. Now, he said, you are beginning to understand why I have spent 20 years as a free man still coming to sit in this colonnade most afternoons, arguing with anyone willing to argue back. Come find me again tomorrow, if the question is still with you. I suspect it will be. He did come back. Not the next day he spent in a fog of ordinary business, meeting with the grain merchants who had underwritten his voyage, absorbing their losses along with his own, watching men who had trusted him with fortunes decide, with varying degrees of grace, how much of the disaster to forgive and how much to hold him accountable for. It was a brutal, grinding day, full of exactly the kind of Chinese letter, the kind of matters that were, in Nicandros's terms, not up to him, other men's judgments of his competence, the fate of his reputation among the trading houses of Austria, whether he would ever captain a ship again. He noticed walking home that evening that he had spent the entire day in a state of low, grinding anxiety about outcomes that had already, in every practical sense, been decided by men other than himself, in rooms he could not enter based on considerations he could not fully know. He had done what was his to do, presented the facts honestly, taken responsibility where responsibility was his to take, apologized where apology was owed, and then had gone on suffering anyway, as though the suffering itself were a form of penance that might yet change the outcome. It was, he realized with a small, unwelcome jolt of recognition, exactly the error Nicandros had described. He had been trying to control, through the sheer intensity of his anxiety, an outcome that was no longer his to control at all. He found the old man in the same colonnade 3 days later. "I noticed something," Cordus said without preamble, sitting down beside him. "I spent an entire day worrying about whether the merchants would ruin me, as though my worrying could change their decision. It couldn't. It never could. All it did was make one bad day feel like two. Now you're beginning to see the shape of the thing." Nicandros did not look surprised or particularly pleased with himself, which Cordus appreciated. There was none of the smugness in him that Cordus had encountered in other men who fancied themselves wise. This is the first and hardest discipline, learning to locate, in any given moment of suffering, the precise boundary between what you can act on and what you can only endure. Most men never learn this. They spend their entire lives at war with weather, with other men's opinions, with the simple fact of mortality, exhausting themselves in battles they were never equipped to win, and calling the exhaustion virtue, when really it is only confusion dressed in virtue's clothing. But how does a man live, practically, once he's made this distinction? It's one thing to say, "I understand that the merchant's judgment isn't mine to control." It's another to actually stop caring what they decide. You misunderstand me again, though I forgive you for it. It's the most common misunderstanding, and I made it myself for years. I am not telling you to stop caring what they decide. Care as much as you like about the outcome, in the sense of hoping it goes well, working toward it going well through whatever means are actually yours to employ. What I am telling you to release is the demand that it go well, the silent, exhausting insistence buried under most men's ordinary desires that the universe is obligated to arrange itself according to your preferences because your preferences are reasonable and your effort has been sincere. The universe owes you neither outcome. It never has. This is not because the universe is cruel. It is because the universe is not, in the way we imagine when we're small children praying to it, a person at all. It is a vast lawful unfolding of cause and effect, and your reasonable preferences are simply not among the forces that determine its next moment. Cordus was quiet for a time, watching a porter across the colonnade struggle with a badly balanced amphora, watching him adjust his grip, find his footing, and continue on. "You said, the first day, that this was the oldest question you knew. Where does it come from? Is it your own, or did you learn it from someone?" "I learned the seed of it from a teacher of my own many years ago, when I was still a slave and had every material reason to believe that nothing in my life was within my control, which turned out, strangely, to be the ideal condition for learning the lesson clearly, since a slave has no illusions left to strip away about owning his circumstances. A free man can spend decades believing his wealth and his health and his good name are extensions of himself, parts of his own being that he has earned and therefore possesses by right. A slave knows from the first day that none of it is his, not his body's labor, not his time, not even, in the most brutal households, his own children, who could be sold away from him at another man's whim. I used to think this made slaves uniquely qualified to understand what I'm telling you. I no longer think that. I think it simply removed one layer of illusion faster than it is removed for most free men, who often go their whole lives without ever discovering that the ground they thought was solid was never solid at all until, of course, a storm or a fever or an ordinary accident of time removes it for them all at once, exactly as it has for you. Your teacher, was he a philosopher by trade? He had been a slave himself in his youth before a cruel master and then, later, a kinder one, and he taught for years afterward from a small room that could not have held more than 20 men comfortably, though far more than 20 came to hear him, some walking for days to do it. He used to say that philosophy was not a subject to be studied the way a man studies rhetoric or geometry, as an accumulation of clever things to say at dinner. He said it was a medicine, and that a man who read every treatise ever written on the nature of fever without ever applying a single remedy to his own body when the fever came was not a physician. He was a collector of words about medicine, which is a very different and much less useful thing. I have tried, not always successfully, to be a physician rather than a collector. Cordus turned this over. Somewhere in the back of his mind an old memory stirred, a rumor he had heard once from a merchant who traded in books and had spent time in the eastern provinces, of a lame former slave who had taught philosophy to men who came from every corner of the empire, whose sayings were still copied and passed hand to hand among those who cared for such things decades after his death. He did not ask if this was the same teacher. It did not seem to matter, in the end, whose voice had first shaped the thought. What mattered was whether the thought was true, and whether it could bear the weight Cordus needed to put on it. "Teach me the rest of it, then," he said, "whatever there is." Asterisk. Over the weeks that followed, through the last heat of that terrible summer, through the early cool of autumn, through a season in which the fever moved through Rome and its ports like a slow-burning fire that would not be fully quenched for years, taking, before it was done, a number of lives that would later be spoken of in the same breath as the great plagues of history, Cordus returned again and again to the colonnade, and to other places besides, wherever Nicandros happened to be sitting on a given afternoon, and the old man taught him, in fragments, the rest of what he called, without any grandness in his voice, simply asterisk the discipline dot asterisk. He taught him that fate, the great unbroken chain of causes stretching back before any man's birth and forward past any man's death, was not an enemy to be fought but a river to be swum with rather than against. "You did not choose the storm," Nicandros said one afternoon, as they walked together along the harbour, watching new ships being loaded to replace, in some small measure, what the sea and the plague between them had taken from the city's trade. "But you chose, in the middle of the storm, to take up the axe and cut the mast free rather than to freeze, or to curse the sky, or to abandon the wheel. That choice, that specific, narrow, entirely yours to make choice, was where your freedom lived, in a night when almost nothing else was free. A man who understands this stops asking the impossible question of why the storm came, which has no useful answer, and starts asking the only question that has ever mattered given that the storm has come: what is mine to do now? He taught him about the discipline of desire, which was harder for Cordus than almost anything else Nicandros offered, the idea that a wise man learns, slowly and never perfectly, to want only what is actually within his power to secure, and to meet everything else, the outcomes that depend on fortune or on other men's choices or on the plain unpredictability of a world too vast for any one person's preferences to govern, with a kind of clear-eyed acceptance that was not resignation, because resignation implied defeat, and this was something else, closer to the acceptance a good sailor has for the wind. "You do not resent the wind for blowing from the north when you wish to sail south," Nicandros said. "You do not consider yourself defeated by it. You simply adjust your sail, or you wait, or you choose a different course, and you do this without any of the exhausting inner rage that another man might spend on cursing a wind that was never going to listen to his curses in the first place. This is not weakness. I would say it is the opposite of weakness. It takes far more strength to meet an unwanted wind with clarity than to meet it with fury, and the man who has trained himself to the first response has more strength left over at the end of the day for the things that are actually his to change. He taught him, too, about the discipline of action, that a Stoic was not, whatever his enemies liked to claim, a man who withdrew from the world's struggles into a cold private peace, indifferent to the suffering of others. Some men hear the teaching about what is and isn't within our control, Nicandros said, and conclude from it that they need not act at all, that since outcomes are not truly ours to determine, effort is pointless, and the wise course is simply to sit and watch the world unfold with a philosophical shrug. This is not wisdom. This is cowardice wearing wisdom's clothing, and I have no patience for it. You are not asked to stop rowing because you cannot control the current. You are asked to row as well as you possibly can with everything your strength allows, precisely because the rowing itself, the full and honest exercise of the part of the work that is yours, is the entire domain in which a human life finds its worth. What you release is not the effort. What you release is the demand that your effort be rewarded with the specific outcome you had in mind when you began. Cordus, listening to this on a bench near the harbour with the smell of tar and salt in the air, thought of the axe in his hands on the night of the storm, of the mast falling, of the ship rising against every reasonable expectation, and understood for the first time since Ostia that there had been a kind of dignity in that night after all, not because the outcome had been good, since 11 men had died and the cargo had been lost regardless of how well he had rowed against the current, but because he had rowed as well as a man could row, had done everything that was genuinely his to do, and that this fact remained true and remained his no matter what the sea had decided to do with the rest of it. It was around this time that Cordus began, almost without noticing he was doing it, to carry Nicandros's arguments into other rooms of his life, testing them the way a man tests a new tool against old wood to see whether it would hold. The clearest test came from an unexpected quarter. His old friend Aulus, a wine merchant he had known since boyhood, who had heard second-hand of Cordus's afternoons in the colonnade and made no secret, over dinner one evening, of what he thought of them. "You've taken up with the Stoics," Aulus said, not quite as an accusation but close to one, turning his cup in his hands. "I've watched it happen to other men. First the calm, dignified talk of what is and isn't within our power. Then, a year later, a man who has stopped laughing, stopped weeping, stopped wanting anything at all, congratulating himself on his own numbness and calling it wisdom. I liked you better broken, Cordus, if I'm honest. At least a broken man is still a man. I worry your philosopher is teaching you to disappear." "He's taught me the opposite," Cordus said, though he found, turning the accusation over, that some corner of him had wondered the same thing in his quieter moments, whether the peace he was building might, if he wasn't careful, curdle into something colder than peace. "He's not teaching me to want nothing. He's teaching me to stop mistaking the things I can't control for the things I can, so that I spend my strength where it does some good instead of exhausting it on a sea that was never listening in the first place." A pleasant distinction in speech. Less pleasant, I suspect, when your own bones are the ones testing it. Aulus leaned forward. "Here is what I don't understand, and perhaps you can carry the question back to your teacher, since you clearly won't be persuaded by anything I say tonight. Your Stoics tell me that all things unfold according to fate, one unbroken chain of cause running from the first moment of the world to the last, so that the storm that took your ship was fixed in its course before either of us was born, exactly as fixed as the fever that took your wife. Very well. But then, in the same breath, they tell me that I am free, that my choices are genuinely mine, that virtue and vice are within my own power. How can both of these be true at once? Either the chain determines everything, in which case my so-called choices are simply the chain working itself out through me, no more free than a stone is free to choose the direction it rolls down a hill, or something in me stands outside the chain and breaks it, in which case your fate is not, after all, unbroken. I have never heard a Stoic answer this cleanly. I suspect it is because it cannot be answered cleanly. Cordus did not have an answer of his own, and said so honestly, and the question sat with him uncomfortably enough that he carried it, as Aulus had predicted, back to the colonnade the following week. Nicandros listened to the whole of it without interrupting, and when Cordus finished he was quiet for a moment, turning something over behind his eyes the way a man turns a coin to check both its faces before deciding whether to spend it. "Your friend has asked the oldest and best objection there is," he said finally. "I would think less of him if he hadn't found it, and I think more of you for bringing it to me honestly instead of pretending it doesn't trouble you. Here is what I would say to him, though I doubt it will fully satisfy a man who has already decided the question cannot be answered cleanly, since such men rarely accept a clean answer even when one is offered. Picture a cylinder set rolling down a slope. Once it is pushed, its path down the hill is entirely fixed. The slope determines the line it travels, the speed it gathers, all of it exactly as fixed as any Stoic claims fate to be. But notice the manner of its rolling, the fact that it rolls rather than slides or tumbles or bounces. That is not given by the push alone. It is given by the cylinder's own nature, by the shape it happens to be. A ball pushed the same way down the same slope would roll differently. A cube would not roll at all. It would tumble gracelessly end over end. The push is the same. The response is different because the thing being pushed is different, and the difference belongs to the thing itself, not to the hand that pushed it. Now think of a man as something more than a cylinder, a creature with a ruling faculty inside him, a mind capable of examining an impression before it assents to it, capable of asking, is this true, is this good, is this something I ought to want, before acting on it. Fate pushes every man down the slope of his life exactly as surely as it pushes the cylinder. The storm was going to come. The fever was going to come. Neither of us disputes this. But how a man rolls down that slope, what shape of a man he brings to meet what fate delivers to him, whether he meets the storm with the clear eye of a captain who has trained himself for exactly this, or with the panic of a man who never trained himself for anything, that shape is his own. Fate did not decide on the night of your storm that you specifically would take up the axe rather than freeze. It decided only that a storm would come. The taking up of the axe belonged to the particular man you had spent 19 years becoming through 10,000 earlier choices that were, each of them, genuinely yours in exactly the sense I mean, the shaping, over a lifetime, of the cylinder that fate would eventually push. That is elegant, Cordus said slowly, but I confess I still don't fully see how the shape of the cylinder came to be mine rather than simply one more link in the same chain, my 19 years of training being themselves nothing more than fate working itself out through my father's choices and his father's before him, all the way back, with no place in the whole long chain where anything genuinely new, mine ever entered in. Nicandro smiled, not unkindly. Now you've found the place where the argument grows thin, and I won't pretend to you that it doesn't. I am an old freedman, not a god, and I don't have a proof that settles this the way a geometer settles a theorem. What I have is this: whether or not some further chain lies underneath the chain I can see, whether my choosing to shape myself well was itself at some depth I cannot access, only fate wearing my face. The experience of choosing does not disappear because I cannot prove it stands entirely outside every prior cause. When the storm came, you did not experience yourself as a stone rowing helplessly down a hill. You experienced yourself weighing an axe in your hand and deciding to use it. That weighing, that deciding, is the only country you or I will ever actually get to govern, whatever deeper metaphysics may or may not sit beneath it. A man can spend his whole life arguing about the floor beneath the floor beneath the floor and never once get up and walk across the room he is actually standing in. I would rather walk across the room. Tell your friend Aulus that, if you like, though I suspect he will only pour you more wine and ask the question again in a different shape, since that is what good friends who love an argument tend to do, and there are worse habits for a friend to have. There is something I still cannot make peace with, he admitted, one grey morning in late autumn, as they sat together watching the fishing boats return. You tell me the deaths of my wife and daughter were not a punishment, that the universe does not trade virtue for outcomes. I can accept this with my mind, but some part of me, the part that is not persuaded by arguments, however sound, still wants to know why them? Why then? Not as an accusation against the gods, exactly, but as a genuine question. What is a man supposed to do with a why that has no answer? Nicandros was quiet for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice had lost some of its usual clarity, replaced by something more careful, more personal. I will tell you what I did with mine, though I offer it as one man's answer, not as a universal remedy philosophy that pretends to erase this particular ache in every man the same way as philosophy sold by a merchant, not offered by a physician. I had a son once before I was freed. He died of a fever much like the one that has moved through this city when he was 6 years old, and I had no power at all, as a slave, to secure him better care than the little his mother and I could scrape together with our own hands. For a long time I asked why, the same way you're asking now, and I want to tell you honestly, the question never fully closed. It is still there, somewhere in me, 22 years later. What changed was not that I found an answer. What changed was that I stopped believing an answer was owed to me, and in the stopping, some of the weight came off, not all of it, but some, the specific weight of expecting the universe to explain itself to me in terms a grieving father could find satisfying. The universe does not explain itself. It was never going to. And once I set down the expectation that it would, I found I had more strength left for the parts of my life that were actually asking something of me, my other children, the men who came to learn from me, the small daily work of being useful to the world I still had to live in. The why never closed. But I stopped standing at that door, waiting for it to open, and started walking instead toward doors that would actually let me through. Cordus felt something in his chest give way, not violently, but the way a knot loosens when a hand finally finds the right thread to pull. He did not cry. He had done most of his crying in the weeks right after Ostia in the privacy of Prima's empty room, but he sat for a long time in silence, watching the grey water, and when he finally spoke again his voice was steadier than it had been in months. "Teach me to walk toward the other doors," he said. Asterisk. The first door, as it turned out, was not a metaphor at all, but an actual door on an actual street 2 blocks from his own house, which he passed one evening in early winter and heard, from behind it, the particular thin wailing of a child too young to understand why the adults around her had stopped answering. He had not planned to stop. Every instinct trained into him over the past months by the fever that had taken Livia and Prima, by the general terror that had settled over the city, in which whole households now nailed their doors shut at the first cough, and neighbors who had shared bread for 20 years crossed the street rather than pass too near one another, told him to keep walking, quickly, the way most men in Rome had learned to keep walking that winter. He stopped anyway. He told himself, afterward, that it was not courage, exactly, that made him push open that door. It was closer to a kind of experiment, a wish to discover whether the discipline Nicandros had been teaching him could survive contact with an actual fever rather than only the memory of one. Inside he found a woman perhaps his own age, far gone with the sickness, propped against the wall in the manner of someone too weak to lie down without fear of not rising again, and beside her a girl of perhaps 4, unmarked by the fever herself but frightened past speech, clutching a wooden doll with one arm missing. The woman's husband, he would learn later, had died of the same fever 8 days earlier and had not yet been properly buried because there had been no one left in the house with the strength to arrange it. Cordus felt the old fear rise in him immediately and completely, the specific bodily fear of a man who has already lost a wife and a daughter to exactly this sickness, standing now in a room thick with its smell, watching the same slow ruin work itself out in a stranger's face. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to back out of that doorway and keep walking, and no one, least of all Nicandros, would have called it a failure of philosophy to do so. The old man had never once suggested that wisdom required a man to be reckless with his own life. But he found, standing in that doorway with his fear plainly in front of him, that he could, for the first time, actually see the shape of the choice Nicandros had spent months describing to him. His own eventual death, whether it came from this fever or another, this year or in 30 years, was not up to him, had never been up to him, would not become more or less likely because he stood in this room for an hour instead of walking past it. What was up to him was narrower and closer at hand, whether he sent for a physician, whether he found someone to sit with the child, whether he did, in this one particular room, on this one particular evening, the plain useful thing that his own 2 hands and his own free hour made possible. He sent a boy running for a physician he trusted, though he suspected correctly that little enough could be done for the mother beyond easing what remained of her suffering. He built up the fire, which had gone cold. He found bread in the kitchen and fed the girl, who ate the way frightened children eat mechanically, without any evident pleasure in the food, watching him the entire time with an unwinking wariness that reminded him, more than he was prepared for, of Prima at that same age, on the mornings after a bad dream, when she had needed to be held before she could be reasoned with. The woman died 2 nights later, with Cordus and the physician both present, and with something that might have been gratitude in her eyes at the end for the fact that her daughter would not be alone in the room when it happened. He arranged, in the days that followed, for the girl, her name was Tullia, to be taken in by an aunt on the Aventine who had survived the fever herself earlier that autumn and had, as a consequence, no fear left of catching it a second time. He visited them twice before Tullia settled fully into her new household, bringing on the second visit a small carved horse to replace, in some inadequate but sincere way, the doll's missing arm, and then he did not visit again, judging correctly that the child's healing lay now in forgetting the stranger who had found her that terrible winter, not in being reminded of him. He told Nicandros about it afterward, expecting, he realized only as he was speaking, some kind of approval, some confirmation that he had done the thing correctly. Nicandros gave him something better than approval. He gave him the plain truth. You did not save her mother. Nothing you did or could have done would have saved her mother. The fever had already decided that question before you ever pushed open the door, and no discipline of mine or any other philosopher's changes what a fever has already decided. What you did instead was smaller than saving her, and I would say, if you'll permit an old man his opinion, considerably more important than saving her would have been, since saving her was never within your power to begin with. You made sure a dying woman did not die believing her daughter would be left entirely alone in the world. You made sure a frightened child had bread, and a fire, and a carved horse, and a family waiting on the far side of her fear. None of that required you to defeat fate. All of it required only that you show up, with your fear plainly acknowledged and not obeyed, and do the narrow, particular, entirely human-sized thing that was actually yours to do. This is the whole of what I mean by the discipline of action, Cordus, and I would rather you understood it from this one evening in a stranger's house than from 100 more afternoons of listening to me describe it in the abstract. Asterisk. The winter that followed was not easy. Nicandros never promised him it would be, and Cordus would have distrusted the promise if it had been made. There were nights he woke reaching for Livia before he remembered, mornings he set out 2 bowls at breakfast before he caught himself. Grief, he learned, did not obey the tidy schedule a man might wish to impose on it. It came in waves, exactly like the sea, sometimes calm for weeks and then, without warning, cresting over him in a moment as raw as the first. But he found, increasingly, that he could meet these waves differently than he had met the first ones. He no longer added to the grief the second layer of suffering, the outrage, the sense of injustice, the exhausting inner argument with a universe that was not listening and had never promised to listen. He let the grief be grief, walked through the center of it as Nicandros had taught him, and found, each time, that it eventually released him back onto dry ground, a little more solid than before. He returned to the sea that spring, not because the grief was gone but because, as Nicandros pointed out, the rowing was still his to do, and a man who had spent his life reading storms and guiding ships through them had a genuine use to the world that did not disappear simply because the world had used him hard. The grain merchants, in the end, had forgiven him the loss. The wreck of the Fortuna Maris had been examined by men who understood weather and cargo and knew that no captain living could have avoided that particular storm and lived to tell of it, and several of them, in fact, sought him out specifically for his next voyage, reasoning correctly that a captain who had survived that storm and brought 11 men home alive when a lesser captain would have brought back none was exactly the kind of captain they wanted holding the wheel when the next storm came. He captained a new ship that spring, smaller than the Fortuna Maris, plainer, without the fine carved figurehead his old ship had carried. He had not the heart yet for anything ornamental but seaworthy, and his, in the only sense that Nicandros had ever taught him, a ship could be a man's, not a possession to be clutched against the world's indifference, but a tool to be used well for as long as the using of it was given to him, and released without rage when it was, someday, inevitably, taken back. On the night before he sailed, he went to find Nicandros one last time, and found the old man in his usual place near the grain exchange, though the season had turned cold enough that he had wrapped himself in a heavier cloak than the plain grey tunic Cordus had first seen him in. "I wanted to thank you," Cordus said, sitting down beside him, for what he suspected, though neither of them said it aloud, might be the last time his new route would take him further and for longer than his old one, and men in their profession did not always come home to find the same faces waiting in the same colonnades. "You gave me something I didn't know how to ask for. I came to you broken in a way I didn't have words for, and you didn't try to unbreak me. You didn't tell me the breaking wasn't real, or that it would heal on some particular schedule, or that some god had a plan I simply couldn't see yet. You gave me a way to stand inside the breaking without it destroying everything else I was. I don't fully know how to say what that's worth." Nicandros waved this off, though not unkindly. "Don't thank me as though I handed you a gift I made myself. I only pointed toward a door that was always there, that men far wiser than I discovered long before either of us was born, and that men far wiser than either of us will go on rediscovering long after we're both gone, because grief is old and this particular medicine for it is older still, and neither one is going anywhere as long as there are fathers who bury daughters and sailors who lose ships to storms that were never going to ask their permission first." He looked out toward the darkening harbor, where Cordus's new ship sat at anchor, waiting for morning. "What I would ask you to carry with you more than gratitude is the discipline itself. There will be more storms. Not every one of them will be made of water. Somewhere on the roads and seas ahead of you there is more loss waiting, because that is simply the condition of being a mortal thing in a mortal world, and no philosophy, mine or anyone else's, will change that fact by so much as a hair's breadth. What philosophy can change is what you do with the loss when it comes, whether you meet it as an enemy who has cheated you out of something you were owed, or whether you meet it as the sea itself, indifferent, lawful, entirely beyond your power to argue with, and therefore not worth arguing with at all. Row well, Cordus. That has always been the whole of it. Not the wind, not the current, not the outcome waiting at the far shore. Just the rowing, done as well as a man is able, for as long as the oar is given to him to hold. Asterisk. Cordus sailed at dawn. He would go on to captain ships for 11 more years, through fair seas and foul, through further losses that Nicandros's teaching had promised him, and did not fail to deliver a second wife, whom he married 4 years later and loved without reservation and without, this time, the illusion that loving her guaranteed her permanence, a grandchild he would not live to see grow to adulthood, a body that grew, as all bodies do, less capable with each passing year of the labor the sea demanded of it. He would think of Nicandros often in those years, and would, in time, become something like a teacher himself to younger captains who came to him bruised by their own storms, though he never claimed the title and always insisted, when pressed, that he was only passing along a door someone else had shown him first. The clearest test of everything he had learned came 7 years after that last conversation in the colonnade, on a voyage he had not wanted to make and had made anyway, carrying his second wife's youngest brother, a boy of 19 named Titus, who had begged for a berth on Cordus's ship the way young men beg for the things that will make them feel, for the first time, like something other than boys. Cordus had trained him through a full season, the way he had once been trained himself, the reading of clouds, the feel of a swell through the soles of the feet before the eyes could confirm what the body already knew, and had come, without entirely intending to feel toward the boy something close to what he imagined he might have felt toward a son had the sea and the years given him one. They were 3 days out from Ostia, running before a wind that had turned faster and harder than the sky had promised, when a line parted under strain and the boom swung loose across the deck with the particular blind violence of a thing no longer under any man's control. Cordus saw it coming a half-second before it struck, long enough to shout, not long enough to do anything else, and watched Titus go down under it, and for one long, suspended moment believed, with the flat certainty of a man who has seen enough injuries at sea to know the difference between a bad one and a fatal one, that he was about to bury a second child in a season not his own. He did not freeze. This, afterward, was the thing he found himself turning over most, not the outcome, though the outcome mattered enormously, but the plain fact that some part of him, built over 7 years of afternoons in a colonnade and countless smaller trials since moved before his fear had finished arriving. He had the boy's head steadied and his own weight braced against the roll of the deck before he had consciously decided to do either. He gave the orders the ship needed while some other part of him, further back, catalogued with a terrible clarity exactly how frightened he was, and let that fear exist alongside the orders without once allowing it to replace them. Titus lived. His arm did not set cleanly and troubled him for the rest of his life on cold mornings, but he lived and sailed again within the year, more cautious and, Cordus thought, considerably wiser for the caution. It was that night, though, sitting alone at the stern once the boy was settled and the sea had quieted, that Cordus understood something about Nicandros's teaching he had not fully grasped even after 7 years of trying to live inside it, that the discipline was never a single door, opened once and then simply walked through for the rest of a man's life. It was a door a man had to find again in every storm, sometimes in the space of half a second, with no time at all to remember the arguments that had first persuaded him, so that what the years of practice had actually built in him was not a settled conviction he could recite, but something closer to an instinct, a shape his mind now fell into under pressure the way a trained hand falls into the correct grip on a familiar tool without needing to be told. His second wife, Emilia, fell ill herself in the last years of his sailing life, with a wasting sickness the physicians had no clear name for and no remedy to offer beyond patience and whatever comfort could be managed. Cordus sat with her through the worst of it, and found, to his own quiet surprise, that the sitting was easier than he had once imagined it could be, not because he loved her less than he had loved Livia, but because he had, by then, spent decades learning to hold his loves the way Nicandros had first described to him on a stone bench near the grain exchange, fully, without reservation, and without the added cruelty of insisting, underneath the love, that the world owed the loving of it a longer season than the world had actually granted. Emilia died on a spring morning with the window open and the sound of gulls coming up from the harbour, and Cordus grieved her completely, walked through the centre of it exactly as he had once been taught to, and did not, this time, spend a single day arguing with a marble god in an empty temple. There was, he found, nothing left in him that needed to argue. There was only the grief itself, honest and unaccompanied, and beneath it, steady as a keel, the life that remained his to keep living. He never fully stopped grieving Livia and Prima. He came to understand, in time, that this had never been the goal, and that a life which had stopped grieving them entirely would have been a smaller, poorer thing than the life he actually lived, which held the grief and the gratitude together in the same hand, the way a man might hold both the memory of a wave that had nearly drowned him and the memory of the shore he had eventually reached, understanding that the two were not opposites but a single continuous fact about the sea and about the living of a life upon it. What he carried instead, in place of the demand that the world explain itself to him, was something quieter and, he came to believe, considerably more durable, the discipline of the oar. He could not choose the wind. He had never been able to choose the wind. though he had spent much of his early life pretending, through sheer effort and sheer care, that he somehow could. What he could choose every single day, in every storm and every calm alike, was how he held the oar and how completely he gave himself to the rowing, and this turned out, in the end, to be enough, not because it changed the sea, which it never did and was never going to, but because it changed him into a man who could meet the sea, whatever face it wore on a given morning, without breaking against it. He kept for the rest of his life a small clay lamp shaped like a dolphin on a shelf in whatever house he was living in at the time, not the one Prima had given him, which the storm had taken along with everything else, but one he had bought for himself in the weeks after Ostia, in a gesture he could never fully explain even to himself, except to say that some part of him had wanted, even in the depths of that first grief, to keep a small light burning against the dark, not because he believed it would call anyone home who was not coming, but because the lighting of it each evening was entirely his to do, and there was, he had learned, a kind of peace available to a man in the simple, faithful performance of the things that remained his, the oar in his hands, the flame in the lamp, the choosing, again and again, however the sea was behaving that day, to row.